My biological father slammed his heavy hands onto my mahogany desk, his face flushed with a desperate, ugly rage. Blood counts for something. That fortune is part of my legacy, whether you admit it or not. He spat, gesturing wildly to his sleazy lawyer standing nervously by my office door. I sat back and looked at the man who had casually thrown me into an orphanage at 10 years old. Simply because I wasn't born a boy. He expected me to write a massive check to save him from absolute ruin. Instead, I slid a single, thin folder across the polished wood. What was inside that folder didn't just destroy his ridiculous demands. It completely erased him from my life forever. Before I tell you exactly how I crushed the man who threw me away, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. I grew up in a pristine, meticulously manicured suburb of Portland, Oregon. It was the kind of neighborhood where the lawns were clipped so short they looked like artificial green carpets, where the driveways were always free of oil stains, and where the houses all matched in a suffocating uniform shade of beige. Outwardly, my family was the absolute picture of the American dream. My father, Nathaniel Ward, was a prominent branch manager at a major commercial bank downtown. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and rigid expectations. He wore immaculate, custom-tailored suits, drove a spotless silver sedan, and demanded absolute perfection from everyone who drew breath under his roof. But in his eyes, perfection was strictly and exclusively tied to gender. He measured his worth, and the worth of his entire household, entirely by the sons who would one day carry on his name. My two older brothers, Thomas and Andrew, were the undeniable center of his universe. Thomas, the oldest by 4 years, was the golden boy. He was a massive, broad-shouldered linebacker on the high school varsity football team and the charismatic president of the debate club. I remember one specific Friday night when Thomas got a minor promotion at his summer job at the local hardware store. He had been bumped up from a floor sweeper to a cashier. My father acted as if Thomas had just been elected to the Senate. He bought a premium cut of steak for the whole family, fired up the expensive grill on the patio, and opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for years. He clinked his heavy crystal glass against Thomas's water glass and talked for an hour about the boy's limitless, bright future. Andrew, the middle child, wasn't far behind in my father's esteem. His bedroom shelves visibly sagged under the sheer weight of shiny gold soccer trophies and heavy academic decathlon medals. Their victories, no matter how small, were celebrated at the dinner table with loud, booming laughter, heavy backslapping, and an endless stream of vocal praise. Then there was me, Celine, the only daughter, the mistake. My victories looked different, but I fought for them with a desperate, hollow hunger that chewed at my insides. I brought home report cards lined with flawless, straight A's. I won the district science fair in the 3rd grade. I didn't just pour vinegar into a baking soda volcano like the other kids. I spent 3 weeks building a complex, fully motorized, to-scale model of the solar system using foam spheres, wire, and a small engine I salvaged from a broken toy. I remember dragging that heavy, spinning model to the dinner table on a Tuesday evening, my hands covered in dried superglue and silver paint, my heart hammering in my chest. I waited for my father to look at me the way he looked at Thomas and Andrew. He barely glanced up from the financial section of his newspaper. "That's nice, Celine," he muttered, taking a slow sip of his black coffee. He didn't even look at the spinning planets. "Make sure you clean up whatever mess you made in the garage. Thomas needs the floor space for his new weightlifting bench." I tried absolutely everything to match my brothers. I studied late into the night, reading textbooks under my blanket with a flashlight until my eyes burned and watered. I ran track at school until my lungs felt like they were bleeding, just to bring home a ribbon. I even asked for toy trucks, building blocks, and baseball mitts for Christmas instead of dolls, thinking maybe, just maybe, if I acted more like a boy, my father would finally notice me. The approval never came. My existence was treated like a mild, persistent inconvenience, a background noise he had successfully learned to tune out. My mother, Marjorie, offered zero protection. She was a woman who had entirely erased her own personality to fit the rigid mold of a compliant, submissive wife. She stayed home, kept the massive house completely immaculate, and smoothed over my father's sharp, cruel edges with quiet, forced, terrifyingly vacant smiles. She never raised her voice. She never challenged him. She lived as though her only purpose on this earth was to keep the household running without friction. When I would cry alone in the kitchen after being ignored for the 100th time, my mother would walk over and hand me a damp dish towel. She didn't hug me. She never stroked my hair. She just pointed at the stainless steel sink. "Stop crying right now, Celine," she would say, her voice a flat, emotionless whisper. "Men don't like girls who make a fuss. Come here and learn how to scrub these cast iron pans properly. You need to know how to get the grease out. These are skills that will make you valuable one day. Valuable to a husband." She was actively teaching me to be as invisible and submissive as she was. She didn't want me to outshine my brothers because she genuinely, deeply believed my only path in life was to serve someone else. The true turning point, the beginning of my absolute nightmare, happened when I was 9 years old. My mother nervously announced over dinner that she was pregnant again. The atmosphere in the house shifted overnight. My father was ecstatic, slamming his fist on the table in joy, but his happiness was entirely conditional. He declared, with an absolute terrifying certainty, that the baby would be a boy. He didn't wait for a doctor's confirmation. The very next weekend, he bought 3 gallons of sky blue paint and completely remodeled the spare guest room. He bought a tiny leather baseball glove, a miniature football jersey, and framed posters of vintage sports cars, nailing them to the walls himself. When the ultrasound finally confirmed it was indeed a male, my father threw a massive barbecue in the backyard, inviting all his banking colleagues to celebrate his virility. When my little brother, Daniel, was finally born, the dynamic in the house didn't just change. It shattered into jagged pieces. I remember standing in the doorway of the hospital room, clutching the doorframe. My father was holding the screaming, red-faced infant, tears of actual, genuine joy welling in his eyes, an emotion I had never, ever seen him display in my entire life. He held the baby up to the fluorescent light and looked at my exhausted mother. "He's perfect, Marjorie. The true heir. The one who's going to complete this family." The true heir. The words slammed into my small chest like a physical punch. I was 10 years old, standing just a few feet away, but I felt like I had been violently shoved out of a moving car. I realized then that my father didn't just prefer boys. He viewed me as a genetic mistake, a massive waste of space. Over the next few months, as the house revolved around baby Daniel, I became entirely invisible. But being invisible wasn't enough for my father. As I grew older, I was taking up resources. I was a financial liability in a house run by an accountant. The moment that broke my childhood, the memory that is burned into the back of my eyelids, happened late on a freezing Tuesday night in November. I had snuck out of my bedroom to get a glass of water from the kitchen. The hallway was pitch black. As I tiptoed past my father's home office, I saw the heavy oak door cracked open just an inch. A sliver of yellow light spilled onto the carpet. I heard my father's deep voice, laced with a cold, terrifying calculation. "We have 3 boys to put through university now, Marjorie," he said, the sound of ice clinking in his whiskey glass echoing in the quiet room. "The college fund is going to be stretched incredibly thin. We need to prioritize the investments that will actually yield a return." "I know, Nathaniel," my mother replied, her voice trembling slightly, barely audible over the hum of the heating vent. "But what are you suggesting we do?" "I'm suggesting we fix the mistake we made 10 years ago," he said bluntly, without a single ounce of hesitation. "She's a massive drain on our resources, and honestly, she doesn't fit in here. She's always staring at me, always sullen. I've been talking to a lawyer downtown who specializes in family law. If we claim she has severe, unmanageable psychological issues, if we say she's shown aggressive behavior and is a danger to the new baby, the state will step in. They'll take her away. It's a clean break. The state takes the financial burden of feeding and housing her, and we can focus all our capital on the boys." I stopped breathing. The floorboards beneath my bare feet felt like blocks of solid ice. I pressed my hands hard over my mouth to muffle the violent sob tearing up my throat. "Nathaniel, she's our daughter," my mother whispered. It was the weakest, most pathetic defense I had ever heard. "She's a liability," he snapped, his voice sharp like a cracking whip, "and I won't let her jeopardize Daniel's future. We start laying the groundwork tomorrow. I want her gone before Christmas." I didn't sleep a single minute that night. I lay in my bed, staring blindly at the ceiling, my small body completely rigid with a terror so deep it made my bones ache. I kept staring at my bedroom door, waiting for my mother to burst through, to tell me she had stopped him, to pack our bags and run away into the night with me. I waited for hours. She never came. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly quiet, thick with a tension that felt like poison gas. I walked downstairs to the kitchen, my stomach twisting in violent knots. My father was sitting at the head of the long dining table, sipping his black coffee, dressed in his immaculate navy suit, looking completely unfazed. My mother was standing at the stove, her back to the room. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't even turn her head. Baby Daniel was sitting in his high chair near the island, babbling happily and waving his little fists, completely oblivious to the nightmare unfolding around him. I walked slowly past him to grab a ceramic bowl for my cereal. I didn't touch him. I didn't even look in his direction. Suddenly, Daniel let out a sharp, piercing shriek. He had simply dropped his plastic spoon onto the floor, but my father leaped out of his chair with terrifying speed. His chair knocked backward, crashing loudly onto the hardwood floor. "What did you do to him?" my father roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure, manufactured, theatrical fury. I froze, the heavy cereal box slipping from my shaking hands and spilling all over the counter. "Nothing. I swear. I didn't touch him. He just dropped his spoon." "Don't lie to me." My father crossed the kitchen in 2 massive strides and grabbed my upper arm. His thick fingers dug into my skin, gripping me tight enough to leave deep purple bruises. He yanked me violently away from the high chair. "I saw you. I saw you pinch him. You're trying to hurt your baby brother because you're jealous." "No. Please, Dad, no." I screamed, tears streaming down my face as I tried to pull my arm away. I looked desperately at my mother. "Mom, tell him. You were standing right there. You saw me. I didn't even touch him." My mother slowly turned around from the stove. Her face was chalk white, her eyes hollow and completely dead. She looked down at the floor tiles, refusing to meet my desperate, pleading gaze. I think I saw her do it, Nathaniel," she lied, her voice shaking but clear enough to seal my fate. "She's been so aggressive lately. I don't feel safe with her around the baby anymore." My heart stopped beating. The betrayal was absolute, complete, and devastating. It was a physical blow to my chest that knocked the wind out of me. My own mother, the woman who gave birth to me, was actively, knowingly participating in a fabricated lie to throw me away, just to maintain her comfortable life and please her tyrant of a husband. "That's it," my father declared, letting go of my arm and pointing toward the stairs. "Go up to your room. Pack your things. 1 suitcase. Only what's essential. You're leaving." "Where am I going?" I sobbed, my knees buckling as I sank to the cold kitchen floor. "Somewhere they know exactly how to deal with disturbed, violent children," he said coldly, adjusting his tie. "You have exactly 1 hour. Don't make me come up there." I pulled myself up and walked up the stairs like a mechanical zombie. My bedroom, with its pale pink walls and white wooden furniture, suddenly felt like a stranger's house. I pulled my small, battered blue suitcase from the back of the closet. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely work the metal zipper. What was essential when your entire life was being deleted? What do you pack when you are being erased? I folded 3 pairs of worn jeans, a few heavy sweaters, and the battered paperback books that had been my only escape from the reality of that house. I tucked my worn, stuffed gray rabbit, the only toy I had ever truly loved, into the corner of the suitcase. Finally, I reached for my nightstand. Sitting there was a framed photograph of our family from 2 Christmases ago, taken before Daniel was born. I stared at the faces trapped behind the glass. My father looking stoic and important. My brothers smiling proudly. My mother looking timid and small. And me standing slightly off to the side, leaning in, trying so desperately hard to look like I belonged in the frame. I shoved the heavy frame into the suitcase, burying it under a sweater, and zipped it shut. The car ride to downtown Portland was completely silent. The sky outside was a heavy, damp gray, mirroring the absolute dread pooling in my stomach. Cold rain streaked down the tinted windows. My father drove with a relaxed, easy grip on the steering wheel, as if he were just running a routine errand to the dry cleaners. My mother sat in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, completely mute. He pulled the car up to a squat, depressing brick building surrounded by a cracked concrete parking lot. The faded sign out front read, Department of Human Services, Family and Child Services. We walked inside. The lobby was a miserable place. It smelled heavily of stale, burnt coffee, wet wool, and industrial pine floor cleaner. A tired-looking woman with a heavy clipboard and thick glasses met us at the front desk. She ushered us down a long hallway lined with peeling paint into a cramped, windowless office illuminated by buzzing fluorescent lights. My father sat down in a plastic chair and immediately popped open his expensive leather briefcase. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. "Mrs. Ward," the social worker said gently, pushing a pen across the desk. "Are you completely in agreement with this? I need you to understand that once you sign these custody surrender forms, you are legally severing all your rights as a parent. You will have no claim to her." My mother picked up the cheap plastic pen. Her hand trembled so much the pen tapped against the desk. She looked over her shoulder at me for one split second. I saw a flicker of profound guilt in her eyes, but it was quickly swallowed by her lifelong cowardice. She looked down at the paper and signed her name in quick, jerky strokes. She stood up, her posture hunched. "I'm sorry, Celine," she whispered, not looking at me. "You'll understand when you're older." "No, she won't," my father snapped, snapping his briefcase shut with a loud click. He didn't even glance in my direction. He turned to the social worker, shook her hand firmly like a businessman closing a successful merger, and walked out the door. My mother followed him like an obedient shadow. The heavy office door clicked shut. They were gone. Just like that. 10 years of my life, my entire history, erased with a signature. That night, I was placed in an emergency intake group home. I was assigned a narrow, squeaky cot in a dark room with 3 other girls. The cheap sheets smelled strongly of bleach and old sweat. The air was thick with the sound of quiet, muffled sobbing coming from the bed across the room. I sat up on my cot in the dark. I unzipped my suitcase, dug through my clothes, and pulled out the framed family photograph. I traced my finger over my father's face, then my mother's. The pain in my chest was so intense, so physically agonizing, I genuinely thought my ribs would snap in half. But then, as I stared at the people who had discarded me like garbage, something shifted deep inside me. The sorrow burned away like fog under a hot sun, leaving behind a cold, hard, unbreakable anger. I pressed both my thumbs against the center of the glass. I pushed hard until it spider-webbed and cracked. I pulled the photograph out of the ruined frame, ripped it straight down the middle, separating myself from them forever, and dropped the torn pieces into the small metal trash can by the bed. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand. In the absolute silence of that bleach-scented room, I made a blood promise to myself. I would never, ever beg anyone for love again. I would never cry for the people who threw me away. And I would survive this no matter what it took. The emergency group home was just a temporary holding tank, a brief layover before being thrown into the deep, turbulent, unforgiving waters of the American foster care system. It was a brutal, rapid-fire education in how little a child's life actually mattered when there was no blood attached to it, and no money to be made off of it. My first permanent placement was a dilapidated, rotting house on the far east side of Portland. 6 other foster children were crammed into 3 tiny, poorly ventilated bedrooms. The foster parents, a heavily tattooed man who constantly smoked on the porch, and his chronically exhausted, chain-smoking wife, operated the house less like a family and more like a low-budget, poorly managed penal colony. They were clearly and unapologetically in it solely for the monthly state stipend checks. To them, we weren't children, we were a salary. Survival in that house meant learning to become a shadow. The older kids, teenagers who had been hardened and brutalized by years bouncing around the system, were ruthless. They stole food from the younger ones, claimed the best, thickest blankets during the freezing winters, and established a vicious hierarchy based entirely on physical intimidation. I learned very quickly that crying made you a prime target. Speaking up got you shoved down the stairs when the foster parents weren't looking. I became a ghost. I learned how to walk across the warped floorboards without making a single sound. I learned to eat my small, pathetic portions of cold macaroni and cheese in under 3 minutes so no one could snatch my plastic plate away. I woke up at 5 in the morning, long before the sun rose, to do my assigned chores, scrubbing the moldy bathrooms with harsh chemicals and sweeping the entire first floor, just to avoid running into the older boys in the hallway. When that placement inevitably collapsed 6 months later after the police were called to break up a violent, bloody fight in the living room, I was packed up like a cheap parcel and shipped back to the agency. My second foster home felt like a completely different kind of twisted trap. They were a middle-aged, upper-middle-class couple living in a pristine neighborhood. They couldn't have children of their own, and their house was filled with expensive, fragile things. For the first 2 weeks, it felt like a bizarre dream. They bought me 3 new, frilly dresses, a pair of expensive white sneakers, and spoke to me in soft, hushed, artificial tones. They constantly called me sweetheart and princess. But the illusion shattered rapidly. They didn't actually want a traumatized, guarded 10-year-old girl with severe abandonment issues. They wanted a life-sized, compliant doll. They wanted a bubbly, affectionate little girl who would hug them on command, smile brightly for their pretentious country club friends, and magically erase decades of their infertility grief. I simply couldn't do it. My body went completely rigid whenever they tried to pull me into a hug. I couldn't fake the bright, mindless smiles they demanded. I was deeply scarred, secretly grieving the horrific loss of my biological family, and absolutely terrified of trusting anyone new. By the second month, their gentle, loving tones turned to sharp, constant criticism. "Why are you always so sullen, Celine?" the foster mother would complain. Her lips pursed in tight frustration as she watched me read a book. "We bought you that beautiful floral dress, and you haven't even thanked us properly. You won't even twirl in it for my sister. You're so ungrateful." They returned me to the agency like a defective, broken appliance. I remember the drive back to the DHS building, sitting in the pristine leather back seat of their expensive SUV, watching the heavy rain hit the window. I felt absolutely nothing. The numbness was my only armor. My third placement was a highly organized, sterile suburban home. The parents were strictly business. Everything was scheduled, locked up, and meticulously budgeted. They didn't physically abuse me, but they didn't look at me as a human being either. I was literally a line item on their monthly Excel spreadsheet. I earned my keep by doing heavy, exhausting yard work, pulling weeds, mowing the lawn, painting fences, and keeping the inside of the house flawlessly spotless. Their smiles never reached their eyes, and I quickly stopped expecting them to. Through all this endless chaos, I clung desperately to the one thing nobody could take away from me: my brain. School became my ultimate sanctuary. The chaotic hallways and loud cafeterias terrified me, so I hid in the back corner of the library every single day. I buried my nose in thick history textbooks. I completed massive extra credit assignments that weren't even required. I maintained a flawless, untouchable straight-A record. My teachers constantly praised me for being a model, studious, quiet student. But they were looking at me all wrong. They saw academic discipline. They didn't see that my absolute silence and my manic obsession with grades was an extreme defense mechanism. I genuinely believed that if I was perfect on paper, the state wouldn't send me to a worse house. I believed my intelligence was the only shield I had left to keep myself from being destroyed. The only person who saw through my flawless, invisible act was my assigned social worker, Elena Torres. Elena was a terrifying force of nature. She was a fiery, sharp-eyed woman who constantly carried a massive, overstuffed clipboard, wore sensible shoes, and drank terrible, bitter agency coffee from a battered thermos. Unlike the dozens of other overworked social workers who just ticked boxes on a form and rushed through their mandatory monthly visits, Elena actually looked directly at me. During one of her visits to my third foster home, we sat across from each other at the sterile, glass dining room table. The foster mother hovered in the kitchen, pretending to wipe down the counters, clearly trying to listen in. Elena reviewed my pristine report card. She didn't smile. She didn't offer fake praise. She just tapped her cheap pen against the paper. "You're brilliant, Celine," she said, her voice low and intense, keeping it quiet enough that the woman in the kitchen couldn't hear a word. "But you're hiding behind these grades. You're building a massive fortress out of A+. You think if you don't make a sound, if you don't take up any space, nobody can hurt you." I kept my eyes glued to the glass table. I didn't say a single word. My jaw was clenched so tight my teeth ached. "You can't live your whole life holding your breath, kiddo," Elena continued softly, leaning in closer. "You're 11 years old. You're supposed to be loud. You're supposed to make messes. You're supposed to make mistakes." She reached into her battered leather tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. It looked different from the standard state files. "I have a new file for you," she said. I instantly tensed up, my heart rate spiking. A new file meant a new house, new rules, new people to avoid, new ways to be disappointed. "I'm fine here," I whispered defensively, crossing my arms tight over my chest. "I do my chores. I don't cause trouble. Don't move me." "I know you don't cause trouble," Elena sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. "But you're not living here, Celine. You're just surviving. And I found someone who doesn't want a perfect, silent child. He doesn't want a free maid. He just wants a kid who needs a home." She slid the folder across the table until it touched my hands. "His name is James Calder. He's 62 years old. He's a widower. He lives out near the hills. He specifically asked the agency for an older child. Someone the system usually completely gives up on." I stared at the closed folder. 62. A widower. It sounded like an absolute recipe for disaster. Why would an old man living alone want an 11-year-old girl with extreme baggage? What did he expect from me? "I won't call him Dad," I said, my voice hard, cold, and defiant, testing Elena's patience, trying to make her take the folder back. Elena just smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached her eyes. "He doesn't want you to. He just wants to meet you. Come on, Celine. Give me one single afternoon. If you hate it, if you get a bad feeling, I'll bring you right back to this perfectly clean, perfectly miserable house. I promise." I looked at the folder again. Calder. It was just a name on a piece of paper. I didn't know it yet, but that piece of paper was the exact map that would lead me out of hell. The following Tuesday, I sat rigidly in the passenger seat of Elena's battered, noisy sedan as we wound our way out of the city and up through the lush, rain-soaked, winding roads of the West Hills. My stomach was in tight knots. We turned down a long, tree-lined gravel driveway that ended in front of a stunning, sprawling craftsman-style home. It had deep, welcoming porches, wide overhanging wooden eaves, and large, beautifully framed windows that glowed with warm, yellow light against the gloomy, overcast Oregon sky. It didn't look anything like a foster home. It looked like a sanctuary. James Calder was standing on the porch, waiting for us. He didn't rush down the wooden steps. He didn't wave frantically or put on a high-pitched, fake enthusiastic voice like every other foster parent did to impress the social worker. He just stood there, tall and lean, wearing a thick, faded green flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and heavy work boots. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his pale blue eyes studied me with a calm, quiet, unnerving intensity. As I stepped out of the car, clutching my small blue suitcase with white-knuckled hands, he slowly walked down the steps. He didn't reach out to hug me. He didn't even offer a handshake. He stopped a respectful distance away and just looked me directly in the eye. "You must be Celine," he said. His voice was deep, gravelly, and incredibly steady. It didn't waver. "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Come on inside. It's freezing out here and I made tea." I followed him up the steps and into the house. The interior was breathtaking. Polished, dark hardwood floors, massive built-in bookshelves crammed with heavy, worn volumes, and the rich, comforting smell of cedar wood and roasting chicken filled the air. There was a real fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace in the living room. It was the warmest, most inviting place I had ever been in my life. James led me down a wide hallway to a room at the very end. He opened the solid wood door and stepped aside, gesturing for me to go in. I walked in cautiously. The room was incredibly spacious, with a large bay window looking out into the dense, green forest behind the house. There was a solid oak desk in the corner, a comfortable bed covered with a thick, handmade quilt, and a tall, empty bookshelf. But what immediately caught my attention were the walls. They were primed in plain, stark, blinding white. "I didn't paint it," James said, leaning casually against the doorframe, his hands stuffed into his pockets. I looked at him, instantly suspicious. Every other house had forced a theme on me. "Why not?" "Because it's your room," he replied simply, shrugging his shoulders. "I don't know what colors you like. I don't know if you like blue or green or black. I figured you should pick the paint yourself. We can go to the hardware store tomorrow after school if you want. You pick the color, I'll buy the rollers." I stared at him, completely dumbfounded. No one had ever asked me what I wanted. My biological father had painted the nursery blue for a boy before the child was even born, sealing his fate and mine. My previous foster parents had forced me into rooms decorated for children who didn't exist anymore. But James Calder was literally handing me a blank canvas. "Okay," I whispered, the tight, painful knot in my chest loosening just a fraction of an inch. Over the next few weeks, I tested James relentlessly. I expected him to snap. I expected him to pack my bags, yell at me, and call Elena to take me away. I gave him the silent treatment for days at a time, refusing to answer his questions. I refused to eat the dinners he cooked, pushing the food around my plate and staring at the wall. He never yelled. He never guilt-tripped me. If I didn't eat, he simply wrapped the plate in foil and put it in the fridge, telling me calmly it was there if I got hungry later. When I woke up screaming at 2 a.m. from violent nightmares about my biological father locking me in a closet, I would find James sitting in the hallway outside my open door, reading a book under a small, dim lamp. He didn't rush in to smother me or tell me to quiet down. He just sat there, turning pages, making sure I knew he was guarding the door, keeping the monsters out. The real turning point, the moment that bonded us forever, happened during Thanksgiving. James had invited some of his extended family over, a brother, a sister-in-law, and a few grown nieces. The house was loud, filled with strangers, and I was terrified. I hid in the kitchen, standing by the sink, pretending to help dry the silverware. His sister-in-law, Martha, a sharp-featured woman wearing far too much expensive perfume, leaned heavily against the kitchen counter, sipping a large glass of red wine. She looked me up and down with obvious, dripping disdain. "So, James," she said loudly, clearly projecting her voice so everyone in the adjacent dining room could hear, "is this the charity case? Are you sure you know what you're doing? Taking in a troubled, older preteen from the state? You don't know what kind of bad blood she has. At your age, you should be relaxing, taking cruises, not playing savior to someone else's genetic problem." My blood ran ice cold. The heavy silver fork I was holding clattered loudly into the stainless steel sink. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself. I prepared for James to agree with her, to laugh awkwardly, to apologize for my presence and send me to my room. Instead, I heard the heavy, violent thud of a large carving knife hitting the wooden cutting board. James stepped directly in front of me, his broad shoulders completely blocking the woman's view of me. His face was like carved stone. The easygoing, gentle man was instantly gone, replaced by a fierce, terrifying protector. "Martha," James said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Put your wine glass down on the counter. Get your coat. You're leaving right now." The kitchen went dead silent. "Excuse me?" she stammered, her face flushing a deep, embarrassed red. "James, don't be ridiculous. I was just—" "You were disrespecting my daughter in her own home," James interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely zero room for debate or negotiation. "Celine is not a charity case. She is family. And nobody, absolutely nobody, disrespects my family under my roof. Get out." He literally kicked his own blood relatives out on Thanksgiving to protect a foster kid. As the heavy front door slammed shut behind them, James turned to me. He let out a long breath, ran a hand through his silver hair, and offered a small, genuinely apologetic smile. "Sorry about that, kiddo. Martha always was a miserable, bitter woman. Let's eat, shall we?" That night, alone in my room, I cried for the first time in over a year. But I didn't cry from sadness. I cried because, for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely, undeniably, fiercely protected. A year later, at age 12, the adoption was finalized. We stood in the polished, wood-paneled courtroom. The judge smiled, slammed his wooden gavel, and I officially became Celine Calder. I looked up at James, my father. He didn't make a big, theatrical speech. He just placed his large, warm, calloused hand on my shoulder and squeezed gently. It was the most profound, securing anchor I had ever felt. James didn't just give me a last name. He gave me a massive, wide-open future. He noticed that I was constantly sketching in my notebooks, not drawing princesses or animals, but drawing intricate floor plans, houses, and city streets. I was subconsciously trying to design spaces where people couldn't be hurt. Instead of ignoring it, James fed that passion with everything he had. On weekends, he drove me all over Oregon. He took me to the historic Pittock Mansion, spending hours explaining the structural integrity of the grand staircase and the weight distribution of the roof. He took me downtown to the Keller Fountain Park, making me study how the brutalist concrete steps manipulated the flow of water. One afternoon, as we stood looking up at a towering, modern glass skyscraper in downtown Portland, James pointed to the massive steel support beams visible through the lobby windows. "A lot of people think architecture is just about building thick walls to keep the weather out, or building walls to lock people in," he told me, his eyes crinkling against the bright sun. "But that's not true, Celine. Good architecture is about designing spaces that welcome the light. It's about building a foundation so incredibly strong that the people inside feel safe enough to truly live." He looked down at me, his pale blue eyes filled with absolute, unwavering belief. "You have a brilliant mind, kiddo. You're going to build incredible things. I know it." With James standing solidly behind me, the traumatized, invisible, terrified girl vanished. I threw myself into my studies with a new, healthy, blazing fire. I wasn't studying out of fear of being thrown away anymore. I was studying out of pure passion. I graduated high school at the very top of my class. And when the thick acceptance letter to Cornell University's prestigious architecture program arrived in the mail, James framed it in thick oak and hung it right in the center of the living room wall, right above the fireplace. He didn't have a massive college fund saved up for me, or so I thought at the time, but he worked extra hours consulting, took out loans, and made absolutely sure I never had to worry about a single tuition bill. I was on my way. I was finally building my own life, and I had absolutely no idea that a few decades later, the massive fortune James was secretly building for me would become the very weapon I would use to utterly destroy the man who threw me away. By the time I hit my late 20s, I had built a thick armor made of ambition and caffeine. I was working at one of the most prestigious commercial architecture firms in the Pacific Northwest. Outwardly, I was a massive success story. I was the youngest junior architect on the floor, but the reality was a brutal, exhausting grind. I was working 14-hour days, 6 days a week, designing parking garages and sterile office lobbies. I was bringing in massive contracts for the partners, but my starting salary barely covered the rent for my tiny studio apartment downtown. I was desperate for a promotion. I wanted to build community centers, shelters, places that actually mattered, but I was stuck drafting glass boxes for corporate billionaires. Through it all, James was my absolute rock. Every Sunday morning, without fail, I drove out to the house in the West Hills. We would sit on the back porch, drink black coffee, and talk about everything from structural engineering to the changing seasons. He never pressured me. He just listened. He was the only person in the world who made the noise in my head stop. Then the ground fell out from under me. Started small. James looked a little thinner around the holidays. He brushed it off as getting older, saying his appetite wasn't what it used to be. But a few months after my 30th birthday, the truth hit us like a freight train. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The doctors were blunt. It was aggressive, it was advanced, and it was terminal. I didn't even hesitate. I walked into my managing partner's office the very next morning, handed over my massive portfolio of active projects, and quit. I didn't care about the salary. I didn't care about the promotion I was finally in line for. The only thing that mattered was the man who had saved my life when I was 11 years old. I moved back into the room James had let me paint all those years ago. The house that had once felt so enormous and full of life suddenly felt like a ticking clock. We didn't opt for the aggressive chemotherapy that would keep him tied to a hospital bed. James made it incredibly clear. He wanted to be home. He wanted to look at his trees. Those last 6 months were the hardest, most beautiful days of my life. The mornings were dictated by harsh reality. Managing his pain medication schedules, helping him walk to the sunroom, blending soft foods he could actually swallow. But the afternoons belonged to us. We sat by the large bay window watching the rain hit the glass. I would show him my private sketchbooks. Not the corporate glass boxes I drafted for the firm, but the real designs. Affordable housing units that actually looked like homes. Community centers with massive skylights. Even as his physical body withered away, his mind remained incredibly sharp. One evening, the pain was particularly bad. He gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. I sat on the floor next to him, holding his hand, feeling completely helpless. He looked down at me, his breathing shallow and labored. "Don't let them turn you cold, Celine," he whispered, his voice raspy. "You survived the worst parts of this world. Don't let the corporate grind extinguish that fire in you. Build something that outlives us both. Promise me." "I promise, Dad," I choked out, tears spilling hot down my cheeks. It was the first time I had called him Dad out loud. He smiled, closed his eyes, and squeezed my hand. 3 days later, the house went completely silent. The funeral was a blur of gray skies and black umbrellas. I expected it to be small. James was a private man. But as I stood at the front of the chapel, I watched in awe as the room completely filled up. There were former foster kids he had mentored. There were local business owners he had quietly bailed out of debt. There were neighbors, librarians, and mechanics. He had woven a massive safety net of kindness throughout the entire city, and he had never bragged about it once. I stood at the podium and delivered his eulogy. I didn't cry. I spoke with absolute clarity. I told the crowded room that James Calder didn't just give me a home. He gave me my humanity back. A week after the funeral, I received a stiff, formal letter from his lawyer requesting a meeting regarding the estate. I drove downtown expecting a quick reading of a simple will. I assumed he had left me the house in the West Hills and whatever modest savings he had in his checking account. I was fully prepared to go back to the grueling corporate grind to pay the property taxes. I sat down in the lawyer's plush leather chair. The man adjusted his glasses, broke the seal on the heavy envelope, and handed me a thick stack of financial documents. I looked at the bottom line on the first page. I blinked. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The numbers didn't make any sense. James Calder had not been a simple middle-class retiree. Before his wife passed away decades ago, he had owned a massive logistics company. He had sold it quietly, taken the capital, and invested it with surgical precision into commercial real estate and tech stocks over the span of 30 years. He lived in flannel shirts and drove a 10-year-old truck by choice, not necessity. The total value of the estate, the liquid assets, the property portfolio, the trust accounts, all of it was left entirely to me. The inheritance totaled over $27 million. I dropped the paper onto the desk. The air left my lungs. 27 million. It was an unfathomable amount of wealth. I sat in that quiet office, staring at the polished wood desk, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. James had known. He had known the exact kind of financial anxiety I carried from my childhood. He knew my biological father had thrown me away to protect a college fund. James had quietly, diligently built a massive, unbreakable fortress of financial security around me, and he never breathed a word of it until he was gone. He didn't leave me money to buy expensive cars. He left me the power to never be at the mercy of anyone ever again. It is impossible to keep a $27 million inheritance quiet. The local business journals picked up the story of the massive transfer of commercial real estate. Within 2 weeks, my name and a terrible corporate headshot were splashed across local news websites. The headline read, "Local architect inherits massive Calder fortune." I hated the attention. My phone blew up with messages from distant acquaintances suddenly wanting to grab coffee. Corporate firms that had previously rejected my resumes were suddenly calling with partnership offers. But the absolute worst consequence of that headline arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 months after James passed away. I was at the house in the West Hills, packing up some of James's old books for donation. The doorbell rang. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet house. I wiped the dust off my jeans and walked to the front door. I looked through the side glass panel and my heart stopped dead in my chest. Standing on my porch was a man I hadn't seen in over 2 decades. He looked much older, smaller, and incredibly worn down. His hair was completely white, his shoulders slumped, and the sharp, immaculate suits of his banking days had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting sport coat. But I recognized that face instantly. It was the face that had haunted my nightmares. Nathaniel Ward, my biological father. Standing right behind him, holding a worn leather briefcase, was a sleazy-looking man in a cheap suit. A lawyer. My hands started to shake. The 10-year-old girl inside me wanted to run and hide in the closet. But the 30-year-old woman, the woman James Calder had raised, took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open just a few inches. Nathaniel offered a weak, practiced smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Celine," he said, his voice raspy. "It's me, your father. I know exactly who you are," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "What do you want?" "I've been looking for you for years," he lied smoothly, taking a half-step forward as if he expected me to invite him in. "When I read the news about your situation, I knew it was a sign. It's time to heal the past. It's time to make things right. Family belongs together." I stared at him. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the man made my blood boil. "You didn't look for me," I stated flatly. "You threw me away like garbage because I was a girl. You haven't cared if I was dead or alive for 20 years. You read a headline about money. Don't insult my intelligence." His fake smile faltered. The lawyer stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Miss Calder, please. Mr. Ward has been through a tremendous amount of hardship. We are simply hoping for a private, out-of-court discussion regarding a fair portion of the estate. He is your biological father. In the eyes of public opinion, you owe him a debt of gratitude for bringing you into this world." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "A debt of gratitude? I owe you nothing. Get off my porch before I call the police." I slammed the heavy wooden door right in their faces and threw the deadbolt. I leaned back against the wood, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't panic. I went straight to my desk, opened my laptop, and called the most ruthless private investigator in Portland. I paid him a premium retainer and gave him Nathaniel Ward's name. "I want everything," I told him. "Financials, real estate, family history. rip his life wide open. 3 days later, the PI sat in my living room and handed me a thick, damning dossier. The picture it painted was incredibly satisfying. Nathaniel Ward's perfect, arrogant life had completely imploded. Karma had absolutely destroyed him. He had developed a severe gambling addiction in his 50s, funneling his massive banking salary into offshore casinos. The financial strain had led to a brutal public divorce from my mother, Marjorie. She had taken whatever scraps of money were left and moved to Florida, cutting off all contact with him. But it got better. His precious sons, Thomas and Andrew, the golden boys he had sacrificed me for, they despised him. When Nathaniel tried to drain their trust funds to pay his gambling markers, they legally completely severed ties with him. They changed their phone numbers. They refused to let him see his grandchildren. The man was drowning. He had been fired from the bank for embezzling client funds to cover his tracks. He was facing multiple civil lawsuits. The bank was actively foreclosing on his final, heavily mortgaged property. He was literally weeks away from being homeless. He didn't come to my door looking for a daughter. He came looking for an ATM. The next morning, his sleazy lawyer called my phone. I put him on speaker. "Ms. Calder," the lawyer said, his tone slick and threatening. "My client is prepared to go to the local press. He has an incredibly compelling story. A wealthy man, James Calder, using his influence to essentially buy a vulnerable child from a struggling family. The media would have a field day with the implications. It would entirely ruin your late adoptive father's pristine reputation. However, we are willing to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement in exchange for a one-time settlement of $2 million. Blackmail. He was trying to smear the only man who ever loved me. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I looked at the PI's report sitting on my desk. I smiled. Cold, hard, dangerous smile. "Fine," I said into the phone. "Bring your client to my corporate office downtown tomorrow at noon. We will settle this permanently." My office was located on the 40th floor of a sleek glass high-rise downtown. It was a space designed to intimidate. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city, massive mahogany conference tables, and absolute silence. I wore a sharp, tailored black suit. I pulled my hair back tight. I didn't look like the terrified 10-year-old girl he threw away. I looked like $27 million of pure, concentrated power. At exactly noon, the receptionist escorted Nathaniel and his lawyer into the massive conference room. Nathaniel looked around, trying to hide how desperately impressed he was by the wealth on display. He sat down across the expansive wooden table from me, puffing out his chest, trying to project the arrogant banker he used to be. "I'm glad you finally saw reason, Celine," Nathaniel began, lacing his fingers together on the table. "This doesn't have to be ugly. A $2 million settlement is a drop in the bucket for you. Think of it as retroactive child support. Blood counts for something. That fortune is part of my legacy, whether you admit it or not." I didn't say a word. I just watched him sweat under the harsh corporate lighting. I slowly picked up a single, thin manila folder and slid it precisely across the polished mahogany. It stopped right in front of his hands. "Open it," I commanded. My voice echoed sharply in the large room. His lawyer frowned and opened the folder. The first document was a heavily stamped legal copy of the custody surrender forms he had signed 20 years ago. "You want to go to the press?" I asked, leaning forward, resting my elbows on the table. "Please do, because when you talk to the reporters, I will hand them this. A sworn, notarized legal affidavit where you explicitly claimed I was violently aggressive and a physical danger to your infant son. You fabricated a psychotic diagnosis to legally dump me into the state system without paying a dime of child support. You didn't give me up out of hardship. You threw me away to protect your college fund." Nathaniel's face went completely pale. The arrogant smirk vanished. That was a long time ago. People make mistakes in times of extreme stress. "Keep reading," I instructed coldly. The lawyer flipped the page. It was a detailed, highlighted summary from my private investigator. It listed every single one of his massive gambling debts. It listed his termination for embezzlement. It listed the court documents showing his beloved sons, Thomas and Andrew, had filed restraining orders against him. "You have no family," I stated, my voice slicing through the air like a scalpel. "Your wife left you. The sons you worshipped despise you. You are a complete fraud. And if you ever speak James Calder's name again, I will personally fund the district attorney's investigation into your embezzlement charges. I will bury you in so much legal debt your grandchildren will be paying it off." Nathaniel's hands started to shake violently. He looked at his lawyer, panic flooding his eyes. The lawyer was sweating profusely, realizing he had picked a fight with a billionaire who had the receipts to destroy them both. You can't do this," Nathaniel stammered, his voice cracking. "I'm your father. I'm about to lose my house. The bank is foreclosing on Friday. I'll be out on the street." I leaned back in my leather chair. This was the moment. The exact moment I had waited 20 years for. "I know the bank is foreclosing," I said softly, a dark satisfaction blooming in my chest, "because yesterday afternoon, my investment firm purchased the distressed debt portfolio from your lender." Nathaniel froze. His jaw physically dropped. "What? I bought your debt, Nathaniel?" I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I own your mortgage. I own your house. I own the roof over your head." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. He realized he wasn't sitting across from a victim. He was sitting across from his executioner. "You gave me exactly 1 hour to pack my entire life into a tiny blue suitcase," I said, my voice completely devoid of mercy. "You told me to only pack what was essential. I'm going to be far more generous than you ever were. I am giving you exactly 24 hours to vacate my property. If you are not gone by noon tomorrow, the sheriff will physically drag you out onto the curb." "Celine, please," he begged. Actual tears welled up in his eyes. The great, powerful Nathaniel Ward was reduced to a weeping, pathetic shell. "I have nowhere to go. I have no money. Please, I'm begging you. I made a promise to myself the night you left me in that orphanage," I replied, standing up from the table. "I promised I would never beg anyone for love, and I certainly don't respond to beggars. Get out of my building." I turned my back on him and walked out of the conference room. I didn't look back. The security guards escorted them to the elevators. I watched from the glass walls of my office as he stumbled out onto the rainy pavement, completely broken, utterly defeated, and entirely erased from my life. It was the most satisfying breath I had ever taken. 2 weeks after I evicted Nathaniel Ward from his house, an unexpected email landed in my private inbox. The subject line simply read, "It's Jason." Jason, the middle brother, the one who had always stayed quiet, head down, terrified of my father's wrath. The email was long, awkward, and incredibly painful to read. He didn't ask for a single dime. He didn't ask for a loan. He just apologized. He apologized for being a coward when we were kids. He apologized for standing in the kitchen and watching my father drag me out the door. He told me he had finally broken free of the toxic cycle our father created, and he just wanted to know if I was okay. I agreed to meet him at a small, neutral coffee shop downtown. When I walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked tired, but the arrogance of our childhood was gone. We sat in a booth by the window. The conversation was incredibly strained at first, filled with heavy pauses. But then, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, plastic bag. He slid it across the table. Inside the bag was my worn, stuffed gray rabbit, the one I had packed in my blue suitcase. I had lost it during my first brutal foster home placement. I thought it was gone forever. "I tracked down the agency files," Jason said quietly, looking down at his coffee. "I found the first house they sent you to. I went there a few years ago. The people who ran it had thrown a bunch of stuff in the attic. I dug through it for 3 days until I found it. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't erase what we did. But I wanted you to have it back." I stared at the rabbit. The anger that had fueled me for decades softened, just slightly. I didn't fall into his arms crying. The damage was too deep for a miraculous movie-style reconciliation. I established incredibly strict boundaries. But as I took the rabbit and put it in my bag, I nodded. It was a tentative step, a severely damaged bridge that might one day hold weight again. I left the coffee shop feeling lighter than I had in years. The past was finally dealt with. It was time to build the future. I took the $27 million James Calder left me and I went to work. I didn't buy a yacht. I didn't buy a fleet of sports cars. I bought 3 massive, abandoned commercial lots in the Portland area. I designed the buildings myself. No sterile glass boxes. No cold concrete. I designed warm, beautiful, heavily fortified structures with massive windows, interior courtyards, and state-of-the-art security. I founded the Calder Foundation for Family Futures. Our primary mission was incredibly specific, providing high-quality, completely free, transitional housing, college funding, and intensive mental health counseling for young adults who were aging out of the American foster care system. The kids who had survived the nightmare I survived. 2 years later, we held the grand opening ribbon-cutting ceremony for our flagship building. The local press was there, the mayor was there, but the only people I cared about were the 50 young adults standing behind me, holding the keys to their very first real apartments. I stood at the podium under the bright Oregon sun. I looked out at the crowd. I reached up and touched the simple silver key pendant hanging around my neck, the very first key James Calder had ever given me. Family is not defined by blood, I said into the microphone, my voice ringing clear across the courtyard. Blood is just an accident of biology. Blood is what they use to chain you down. True family is a choice. It is the commitment to show up. It is the people who pick you up out of the dirt, dust you off, and choose to love you every single day, even when it's hard. When we actively choose each other, we build something infinitely stronger than a simple inheritance. We build a fortress. After the applause died down, the crowd mingled. I walked toward the entrance of the new building. A little girl, no older than 10, the exact age I was when my world ended, was standing near the doors. She was a younger sibling of one of our new residents. She looked terrified, clutching a small, battered backpack. I crouched down to her eye level. I didn't overwhelm her. I just smiled, a real, genuine smile. I held out my hand. She looked at my hand for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached out and took it. Her grip was tight. I stood up, holding her hand, and together, we walked through the front doors, stepping out of the cold, and walking directly into the light. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. It's not easy to dig up those old ghosts, but if it helps even one person realize their worth, it was absolutely worth telling. I hope this resonated with you in some way, whether you've dealt with a toxic family or you're just trying to find your own path in the dark. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to completely cut off toxic family members to save your own sanity? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now, if you are still here, listening to my voice right at this very second, I have a special request for you. You belong to a very rare group of people. I want you to go down to the comments right now and simply type the letter W. W stands for winner. That is our secret code. It's the sign of the 1% Club, the incredible people who actually stick around to the very end of the journey. When I see that W, I know exactly who my real community is. If my story moved you, please hit that like button, and don't forget to follow the channel so we can keep sharing these journeys together. Stay strong, keep building your future, and I will see you in the next video.